At the turn of the 20th century, Miami was not yet a paradise, but a city still being forced into existence, shaped by ambition, speculation, and the belief that wealth alone could conquer nature itself. Northern capital flooded south as railroads cut through wilderness, transforming swamps into private land and allowing a new elite to imagine lives untouched by consequence. And within this fragile, unequal moment rose Villa Vizcaya, a European-style palace planted along Biscayne Bay, built not to reflect Miami, but to dominate it. Conceived by industrial heir James Deering, a man born into immense fortune yet increasingly withdrawn from society, the estate was designed as an escape from modern America, a controlled world of beauty, order, and silence, where history could be imported and reality kept outside the gates. While the city around it grew on the backs of invisible labor and social division, Vizcaya emerged as a symbol of old-world refinement recreated through American power, a mansion of marble, gardens, and illusion standing in sharp contrast to the harsh conditions that made its construction possible. Miami was becoming a place where excess felt natural, where privilege could rewrite landscapes and lives, and where a single individual, armed with wealth and obsession, could impose his private vision onto an entire coastline. Villa Vizcaya was not merely a home, nor simply a monument to success. It was a statement of control, born from a city built too quickly, sustained by inequality, and destined to reveal that even the most carefully constructed paradise carries the weight of what it was built upon. Chapter 1. A Man Apart from His Time. James Deering was born into extraordinary wealth, yet from the very beginning of his life he appeared fundamentally disconnected from the world that such wealth was meant to command, raised within the protective certainty of an industrial fortune that promised influence, permanence, and unquestioned authority, but showing little interest in the public performance of power that defined America's elite at the turn of the 20th century. As a member of the Deering family, whose name was inseparable from the rise of American manufacturing and the confidence of a nation convinced that progress was both inevitable and virtuous, he inherited not only immense financial security, but a clear social expectation to expand, to lead, to be visible, to embody the triumph of modern capitalism, an expectation he neither embraced nor openly rejected, but quietly withdrew from. While his contemporaries used inherited wealth to secure political influence, establish institutions, and shape public life, Deering chose distance over dominance, cultivating an existence defined by separation rather than participation, revealing a temperament that found little fulfillment in recognition or legacy as others understood it. He was highly educated, disciplined in taste, and deeply oriented toward aesthetics rather than enterprise, drawn not to the future but to the past, fascinated by European history, classical architecture, and the rigid social order of aristocratic cultures, ideals that stood in direct opposition to the restless, industrial America that had produced his fortune. As factories multiplied and cities accelerated toward efficiency, expansion, and mass production, Deering's instincts moved in the opposite direction, favoring restraint over speed and permanence over innovation, rejecting modernity not through protest or ideology, but through deliberate withdrawal, shaping a life governed by control, privacy, and careful limitation. Socially, he remained elusive and reserved, never marrying, never producing an heir, and maintaining relationships that were formal, measured, and emotionally distant, allowing his wealth to expand his physical autonomy while quietly shrinking the human dimensions of his world until isolation became not a consequence, but a condition of his existence. Chronic illness further intensified this retreat, gradually restricting his mobility and reinforcing a psychological dependence on predictability and order, transforming his fortune from a symbol of power into a protective barrier against uncertainty, discomfort, and decline. Unlike many heirs of his era who believed wealth conferred invulnerability, Deering possessed a sober awareness of its limitations, understanding that money could not halt the deterioration of the body, prevent solitude, or impose meaning on the passage of time, an awareness that bred caution rather than confidence, and encouraged him to seek stability not in people or institutions, but in environments he could control absolutely. Those who encountered him described a man of precision and restraint, meticulous in his standards and reserved in manner, whose life displayed little outward extravagance despite unlimited means, suggesting that for Deering excess was not found in display or consumption, but in authorship, the ability to design surroundings, routines, and experiences according to exact personal specifications. He occupied an uneasy position within his own era, too wealthy to belong to ordinary society, yet too withdrawn to integrate fully into elite circles, too modern to claim true aristocratic lineage, and too nostalgic to embody the American ideal of progress, leaving him suspended between identities without a clear social role or emotional anchor, as others of his class pursued immortality through bloodlines, philanthropy, and public memory. Deering turned inward, seeking permanence through form rather than family, through structure rather than influence, imagining continuity not through descendants, but through spaces that could outlast the fragility of the human body and the instability of human relationships. In a nation accelerating toward the future, he anchored himself to the past. In a culture obsessed with visibility, he cultivated obscurity. And in a society that equated wealth with command over others, he used wealth as a mechanism of withdrawal, constructing a life defined by separation, discipline, and silence. James Deering was not a man ahead of his time, nor one crushed beneath it, but a figure who stood deliberately apart, shaped by privilege yet uneasy within it, quietly preparing to assert control not over people or markets, but over the very conditions of his existence, attempting to build a private order immune to change, decay, and intrusion, even as history moved relentlessly forward beyond his grasp. Chapter 2. Why Miami? Miami was not an obvious choice, and that was precisely why it mattered. At the beginning of the 20th century, Miami stood far outside the cultural and financial centers that defined American power, distant from New York's social hierarchy, Chicago's industrial authority, and the rigid expectations imposed upon men of inherited wealth, existing instead as a humid, unstable frontier where ambition arrived before structure and money moved faster than tradition could follow. To most of the American elite, Miami was unfinished, uncomfortable, and peripheral, a place associated with speculation rather than legacy. Yet to James Deering, it represented something rare and deeply appealing, a city without memory strong enough to resist reinvention. Unlike the established cities of the North, where wealth was embedded in visible hierarchies and long-standing social codes, Miami offered anonymity through distance and authority through scale, allowing immense fortune to operate without the constant scrutiny of peers or the burden of inherited expectations. It was a place where land itself appeared negotiable, where nature could be reshaped, coastlines claimed, and environments redesigned to reflect personal will rather than communal history. For Deering, whose instincts leaned toward withdrawal and control, Miami presented an opportunity not merely to relocate, but to separate himself psychologically and socially from the world that had defined him since birth. The city's rapid growth was fueled by northern capital and speculative confidence, drawing investors who saw Florida not as it was, but as it could be transformed into something profitable and permanent. And this atmosphere of unchecked possibility aligned perfectly with Deering's desire to construct a private world insulated from modern America's noise and speed. Miami was young enough to be molded and distant enough to be forgotten, a place where wealth did not have to justify itself through lineage or public contribution, but could exist as a fact, unquestioned and unchallenged. The social landscape reflected this imbalance, with extreme luxury emerging alongside invisible labor, segregation, and hardship, creating a city where power concentrated quickly and consequence rarely traveled upward, conditions that allowed elite figures to operate beyond moral and social accountability. For Deering, whose health limited mobility and whose temperament favored predictability, Miami's climate and geography offered both physical refuge and symbolic separation, reinforcing a sense of retreat from a nation accelerating toward industrial uniformity. The isolation was not accidental, it was strategic, allowing him to disengage from the expectations of family, peers, and society while maintaining absolute command over his surroundings. In Miami, wealth was not diluted by competition with other old dynasties, nor constrained by established cultural norms, but amplified by emptiness and distance, granting Deering the freedom to imagine a space where his preferences could dominate without negotiation. The city's lack of historical depth meant it could absorb imported identity, enabling European ideals, aesthetics, and hierarchies to be imposed upon American soil without contradiction, a prospect deeply aligned with Deering's admiration for aristocratic permanence and his rejection of modern industrial values. Miami did not ask him to participate, it allowed him to withdraw completely while remaining powerful, to disappear socially without surrendering control materially. This combination of opportunity, isolation, and imbalance made Miami more than a location. It made it a psychological extension of Deering himself, a landscape that mirrored his desire to exist apart from his time while still exerting authority over it. In choosing Miami, James Deering was not chasing novelty or fashion, but selecting a place where his wealth could function without interference, where the past could be imported and the present excluded, and where a man increasingly disconnected from his era could construct an environment that obeyed his need for silence, order, and permanence. Miami offered him the freedom to step outside history while still shaping it, to retreat from society without relinquishing power, and to impose a personal vision upon a city too young, too divided, and too eager for capital to resist, making it the only place in America where his ambition to control space rather than people could fully take form. Chapter 3. Designing an Illusion of Europe. To James Deering, Europe was never a place so much as it was an idea, a carefully curated vision of order, permanence, and hierarchy that stood in deliberate opposition to the America he inhabited, a nation defined by speed, industrial noise, and the uncomfortable truth that wealth could be new, unstable, and socially disruptive. What Deering sought was not authenticity in the historical sense, but control over atmosphere, symbolism, and meaning, an illusion of European continuity transplanted onto American soil, where time could appear slowed and modernity held at bay. His fascination lay not with Europe as it truly existed, fractured by politics, modern pressures, and social change, but with an imagined aristocratic past, one stripped of decay, conflict, and inconvenience, preserved only in marble, proportion, and ritualized beauty. This illusion required intention rather than inheritance, design rather than tradition, because Deering understood that America could never organically produce the aristocracy he admired. It could only simulate it through wealth, disciplined by taste and authority, imposed through environment. Every European reference he embraced was chosen not to educate or impress society, but to construct a private language of power, intelligible only to those already excluded from it. The illusion depended on distance from reality, on transforming history into aesthetic rather than lived experience, allowing Deering to inhabit a world that felt ancient without carrying the burdens of ancestry or obligation that true aristocracy demanded. In this imagined Europe, hierarchy was fixed, beauty was controlled, and the individual stood above time rather than subject to it, a fantasy particularly appealing to a man increasingly conscious of physical decline and personal isolation. The design philosophy was therefore not nostalgic but defensive, using the appearance of age and tradition as a barrier against intrusion, judgment, and the chaos of contemporary life. European forms offered a visual grammar of authority, signaling permanence and inevitability, qualities Deering craved precisely because he knew they could not be guaranteed. This was not cultural admiration in the conventional sense, but selective appropriation, a deliberate extraction of symbols stripped of context and redeployed to serve psychological need. Columns, courtyards, gardens, and interiors were never meant to tell a truthful historical story, but to suspend disbelief, to create a setting where modern America felt temporarily erased and personal control felt absolute. In this illusion, time did not progress. It repeated itself endlessly in curated stillness, reinforcing Deering's desire for predictability and order. Europe, as he imagined it, represented a world where power did not need to announce itself, where wealth was assumed rather than displayed, and where silence itself functioned as a marker of dominance. By designing such an environment, Deering was not escaping America geographically, but conceptually, rejecting its values while exploiting the very fortune it had given him. The illusion also served as a social filter, defining who belonged and who did not, as familiarity with European codes became a quiet test of legitimacy, reinforcing exclusion through taste rather than force. This aesthetic separation mirrored Deering's broader withdrawal from society, translating emotional distance into spatial and visual form. What emerged was a world that looked old but was fundamentally modern in its intent, a controlled simulation of permanence built to satisfy a contemporary anxiety about instability, mortality, and relevance. The illusion of Europe allowed Deering to rewrite his relationship with time, positioning himself not as a fleeting industrial heir but as a timeless figure anchored in an invented past. It masked the contradictions of his existence, concealing the fact that the wealth enabling such refinement was rooted in industrial modernity, not aristocratic continuity. In embracing this illusion, Deering was not denying reality so much as reshaping it into something manageable, something that obeyed his internal logic rather than external change. The result was an environment where beauty functioned as authority, where history became decoration, and where control replaced connection as the highest value. This illusion did not require belief from the outside world. It only needed to convince its creator, offering him a sense of permanence that life itself refused to provide. In designing a Europe that never truly existed, Deering revealed not only his aesthetic preferences, but his deepest fear, that without the appearance of timeless order, both wealth and self might dissolve into the uncertainty of the modern age. Chapter 4. Built by Invisible Hands. The illusion of permanence and refinement that surrounded James Deering's vision could never have existed without a workforce that remained deliberately unseen, a vast network of laborers whose bodies absorbed the cost of transforming fantasy into physical reality, men who arrived without legacy, without protection, and without the expectation of being remembered once their work was complete. At the beginning of the 20th century, South Florida was an unforgiving environment, defined by extreme heat, humidity, disease, and unstable terrain. Conditions that made construction not merely difficult but dangerous, yet it was precisely this landscape that demanded constant human effort to reshape, drain, clear, and control. The workers who carried out this labor were largely drawn from marginalized populations, immigrants, black laborers, and others excluded from the social world. Their work helped create individuals whose presence was essential, but whose identities were intentionally erased from the narrative of beauty and elegance that followed. They worked long hours under harsh conditions, exposed to illness, injury, and exhaustion, performing tasks that required physical endurance rather than recognition, their labor reduced to function rather than humanity. The wealth funding this transformation insulated its owner from these realities, creating a structural distance between vision and execution, where suffering could occur without moral interruption and progress could be measured only in completed surfaces rather than broken bodies. This separation was not accidental. It was fundamental to the system that allowed extreme luxury to exist alongside extreme vulnerability, ensuring that the cost of refinement remained invisible to those who benefited from it. The environment demanded sacrifice, and sacrifice was provided by those with no power to refuse, their work accelerating the creation of a paradise from which they would always be excluded. Injuries were treated as inconveniences, deaths as unfortunate but expected outcomes of progress, absorbed quietly into the background of construction without altering timelines or ambition. The narrative of achievement depended on silence, on the absence of testimony, on the systematic removal of labor from memory once its utility expired. These workers did not shape the design, did not influence the vision, and did not share in the permanence they helped create. Their contribution ended the moment their strength did. In this way, the project reflected a broader truth about wealth in America's industrial age, where capital transformed landscapes through bodies it refused to acknowledge, and beauty emerged only after suffering had been concealed beneath finished surfaces. The estate's refinement masked the brutality of its formation, presenting harmony where there had been chaos, order where there had been strain, and timelessness where there had been urgency and decay. For those who labored, there was no illusion of Europe, no escape from modernity, only physical exertion imposed by someone else's desire for control and permanence. Their lives intersected with Deering's vision only through obligation, never through choice, bound temporarily to a project that would ultimately deny their existence. The very concept of invisibility was essential, because acknowledgement would have fractured the illusion, introducing moral complexity into a world designed to feel inevitable and serene. To remember the laborers would have meant admitting that elegance was not natural, that refinement required force, and that permanence was purchased rather than inherited. Instead, silence preserved the fantasy, allowing the finished environment to suggest effortlessness, as though it had always belonged there, untouched by human struggle. The hands that built it vanished from record, their names unspoken, their stories uncollected, leaving behind only the physical result of their endurance. This absence was not a failure of documentation, but a deliberate outcome of hierarchy, a system in which some lives existed only to support the vision of others, never to challenge it. The estate stood as proof not only of wealth and taste, but of a moral economy that prioritized appearance over accountability, beauty over memory, and permanence over human cost. In this context, invisibility became a requirement, ensuring that the final image remained untainted by the realities of labor, disease, and death that made it possible. The illusion demanded that suffering disappear, that effort dissolve into stone and landscape, and that those who carried the burden fade entirely from view. What remained was not merely a structure, but a silence shaped by exclusion, a reminder that behind every controlled paradise lies a history of unseen hands, their labor absorbed into permanence, their existence erased so that wealth could appear effortless, timeless, and unquestioned. Chapter 5: Life Inside the Gilded World. Life inside the gilded world was defined not by noise or celebration, but by control, routine, and a carefully managed sense of stillness that separated beauty from warmth and luxury from human connection, creating an environment where every detail appeared intentional and nothing was left to chance. Within this enclosed sphere, daily life unfolded according to strict rhythms shaped by preference rather than necessity, insulated from the unpredictability of the outside world, and governed by an unspoken understanding that comfort was meant to be preserved, not shared. Rooms were filled with art, music, and carefully selected objects that signaled refinement and taste, yet these symbols of culture functioned less as sources of joy than as instruments of atmosphere, reinforcing a sense of order and timelessness rather than spontaneity or emotional intimacy. Social interactions were formal, measured, and infrequent, designed to maintain balance rather than encourage closeness, as guests moved through the space as observers rather than participants, aware that they were entering a world shaped entirely by another's vision. Conversation rarely disrupted the calm, and silence itself became a feature of privilege, a marker of distance from labor, urgency, and consequence. Meals were served with precision, not indulgence, reinforcing the idea that excess was not about consumption, but about access, the quiet assurance that abundance existed whether or not it was displayed. Music drifted through rooms not as entertainment but as texture, contributing to an illusion of continuity that made time feel suspended rather than progressing. The boundaries between public and private blurred as the estate functioned both as a personal refuge and a controlled stage where refinement could be observed without intimacy. For its owner, this world offered protection from the chaos of modern life, a space where illness, uncertainty, and social obligation could be managed through environment rather than confrontation. Yet this protection came at a cost, as isolation hardened into routine, and routine replaced connection, leaving luxury to fill the absence of human warmth. The gilded world was rich in surface, but sparse in emotional depth, its elegance masking an underlying stillness that bordered on emptiness. Guests departed, seasons changed, and the world beyond continued to accelerate. But inside, life remained carefully contained, resistant to interruption or evolution. This environment rewarded predictability over passion and order over vulnerability, allowing wealth to function as a buffer against discomfort while simultaneously amplifying distance from shared experience. The absence of family, of laughter uncontrolled by etiquette, and of relationships not defined by formality underscored the quiet truth that luxury alone could not generate belonging. Over time, the space itself began to feel less like a home and more like a preserved state of mind, reflecting a desire to hold life at a fixed point rather than allow it to unfold unpredictably. The gilded world offered safety without intimacy, beauty without chaos, and permanence without growth, revealing the paradox at the heart of extreme wealth, the ability to construct perfection while gradually removing oneself from the very experiences that give life meaning. Within these walls, wealth achieved its highest function, not as display, but as insulation, separating one individual from the demands, risks, and emotional exposure that defined ordinary existence. What remained was a life meticulously arranged, yet increasingly hollow, where refinement substituted for connection and control replaced spontaneity, illustrating how the pursuit of a flawless environment can quietly erode the human presence it was meant to serve. In this world, nothing appeared broken, yet something essential was missing, leaving behind a form of luxury that preserved the body and the senses, while slowly distancing the soul from the unpredictability, intimacy, and imperfection that make life fully lived. Chapter 6: Control, Perfection, and Fear. Control was never a preference for James Deering. It was a necessity born from fear, cultivated slowly as his awareness of fragility deepened, and the illusion of permanence became the only defense against a world he no longer trusted to behave predictably. As his physical health weakened and his emotional distance from others grew, control evolved into the organizing principle of his existence, shaping not only his surroundings, but his perception of safety, meaning, and selfhood. Perfection, in this context, was not an aesthetic indulgence, but a psychological strategy, a way to eliminate uncertainty by refining every detail until nothing appeared capable of disruption. Disorder represented vulnerability, and vulnerability represented loss, whether of dignity, autonomy, or identity. And so every surface, routine, and experience was subjected to scrutiny, adjusted repeatedly until it conformed to an internal standard no one else could fully perceive. This relentless pursuit of precision masked a deeper anxiety, the recognition that wealth could not shield the body from decline, nor guarantee emotional continuity, nor preserve relevance in a world accelerating toward modernity. Deering's fear was not of poverty or public disgrace, but of erosion, of gradual loss without spectacle, of becoming irrelevant within his own lifetime. And this fear demanded constant reinforcement through environment rather than confrontation. Control offered the illusion of mastery over time itself, freezing moments into a permanent state of readiness, where nothing aged, shifted, or decayed unless permitted. Yet perfection proved elusive, requiring continuous adjustment and reinforcing the belief that safety was conditional, never absolute. Each act of refinement heightened awareness of what remained imperfect, creating a cycle where control fed anxiety rather than resolving it. This internal tension manifested as emotional restraint, as relationships became liabilities capable of introducing unpredictability, while objects, spaces, and systems offered compliance without demand. Human connection, with its inherent volatility, threatened the stability Deering sought, and so intimacy was replaced by authorship, by environments that responded only to intention and never contradicted expectation. Fear became quiet but omnipresent, embedded not in overt panic, but in meticulous planning, rigid routines, and intolerance for deviation, shaping a life where spontaneity was perceived as risk rather than freedom. The pursuit of perfection functioned as a defense against mortality, an attempt to externalize control over a reality that increasingly resisted internal command. Every refinement suggested progress, yet each also underscored the impossibility of total mastery, reinforcing a sense of vigilance that never fully rested. This vigilance isolated Deering further, narrowing his world to what could be observed, managed, and corrected, while anything beyond those boundaries faded into abstraction. Over time, control ceased to be a tool and became an identity, defining worth not through relationships or legacy, but through the maintenance of order. Fear, though rarely acknowledged, shaped decisions more profoundly than ambition, guiding withdrawal rather than expansion, stillness rather than engagement. The irony of this pursuit lay in its outcome. The more perfect the environment became, the more fragile it felt, as any disruption threatened to expose the instability beneath. Control promised peace but delivered vigilance. Perfection promised permanence, but reinforced impermanence. And fear, though carefully hidden, dictated the terms of existence. In attempting to eliminate uncertainty, Deering constructed a life increasingly governed by it, where every decision reinforced dependence on control and every moment of calm carried the shadow of potential loss. This psychological architecture mirrored the broader contradiction of extreme wealth, offering the means to shape reality while amplifying awareness of its limits. Control did not free Deering from fear. It organized fear into something manageable, something structured, something that could be lived with, even as it quietly narrowed the scope of experience. In the end, perfection was less a destination than a ritual, repeated endlessly to reassure a man confronting decline that order could still be imposed, even as time advanced beyond negotiation. What remained was not confidence, but containment, not serenity, but stability purchased at the cost of vulnerability, leaving behind a life meticulously arranged around the avoidance of loss and defined as much by what was excluded as by what was preserved. Chapter 7: Illness, Decline, and Withdrawal. Illness did not arrive suddenly, nor did it announce itself with drama. It crept into James Deering's life gradually, manifesting as fatigue, discomfort, and a growing awareness that the body was no longer an obedient instrument of will, but a fragile structure operating beyond command. For a man who had built his existence around control, decline was not merely physical deterioration, but a profound psychological rupture, exposing the limits of wealth, discipline, and perfection. Each symptom carried with it an unspoken reminder that the systems he had designed to preserve stability could not regulate biology. That time advanced regardless of architecture, routine, or intention. As his health worsened, Deering's world began to contract, not because resources diminished, but because engagement required energy he could no longer summon without consequence. Travel became taxing, social obligations burdensome, and conversation increasingly performative, draining rather than sustaining. Withdrawal followed not as a decision, but as an adaptation, a narrowing of life into manageable boundaries where discomfort could be anticipated and controlled. Illness reframed silence from a preference into a necessity, transforming isolation into a protective barrier against exhaustion and exposure. The body imposed limits that no amount of refinement could override, and this reality forced a recalibration of priorities centered not on expansion or legacy, but on endurance. Decline unfolded quietly, measured not in public announcements, but in canceled visits, shortened interactions, and a growing dependence on routines designed to minimize disruption. The estate, once a carefully curated environment of aesthetic mastery, evolved into a sanctuary of containment, its walls serving less to impress than to shield. Withdrawal became both symptom and strategy, reducing the unpredictability of human contact and the emotional labor of maintaining presence in a world that continued to move forward without accommodation. Deering's awareness of his own fragility deepened into a persistent undercurrent of vigilance, as each day required assessment rather than anticipation, management rather than aspiration. The rituals of daily life grew increasingly rigid, not out of obsession, but necessity, as deviation risked physical consequence. Decline eroded not only strength but patience, compressing tolerance for discomfort and reinforcing the impulse to retreat further inward. Social connections, already limited, faded into distance not through conflict but through absence. As sustained engagement demanded resilience, he could no longer reliably provide. Illness altered perception of time, slowing it internally while accelerating it externally, creating a dissonance where the world beyond the gates advanced rapidly while life inside settled into repetition. This imbalance heightened the sense of separation, reinforcing the impression that modern life belonged to others, while his own existence unfolded in parallel, governed by different rules and expectations. Withdrawal offered relief from comparison, from the silent pressure to participate, allowing life to be measured by stability rather than relevance. Yet this relief came with an unspoken cost: the gradual thinning of emotional connection, the quiet erosion of shared experience. Decline stripped ambition of urgency, replacing it with maintenance, and transformed the future from a space of possibility into one of uncertainty. The body dictated terms that wealth could not renegotiate, reminding its owner that privilege could delay inconvenience, but not abolish vulnerability. Illness revealed the ultimate asymmetry of power, where even immense resources could only soften, not prevent, the inevitability of deterioration. Withdrawal thus became a form of dignity, a controlled retreat designed to preserve composure in the face of diminishing capacity. By limiting exposure, Deering retained authorship over how decline was experienced and observed, avoiding the spectacle of weakness by choosing invisibility. This choice preserved order but deepened solitude, reinforcing the paradox that protection often requires separation. As physical boundaries tightened, emotional boundaries hardened, and life narrowed into a carefully managed present, stripped of long-term projection. Decline demanded attention inward, redirecting focus from environment to endurance, from creation to conservation. Illness redefined success not as achievement, but as stability, not as influence, but as continuity. In this stage, withdrawal was not surrender but negotiation, an attempt to coexist with limitation rather than resist it openly. Yet beneath this accommodation lay an unresolvable tension, the recognition that no amount of control could fully reconcile identity with decline. The estate remained intact, the systems operational, the order preserved. But the individual at the center confronted a reality increasingly defined by absence rather than presence. Illness did not dismantle the world Deering had built. It exposed its purpose, revealing that behind the pursuit of perfection lay a fundamental desire for shelter from impermanence. As withdrawal deepened, life assumed a quieter, narrower form, marked less by events than by endurance, illustrating how decline transforms wealth from an instrument of expansion into a mechanism of retreat. In this phase, existence was no longer about shaping the future, but about surviving the present with composure, control, and minimal intrusion, even as time continued its advance without regard for preparation or privilege. Chapter 8. Death Without an Heir. Death did not arrive as a dramatic rupture, but as a quiet conclusion, the final stage of a life that had gradually withdrawn from visibility, leaving behind a world meticulously arranged, yet increasingly detached from human continuity. When James Deering died, there was no immediate successor waiting to assume control, no heir shaped to inherit not only property, but intention, and no living presence prepared to translate private vision into future authority. His passing marked more than the end of an individual. It exposed the fragility of a legacy built entirely around a single will. Without an heir, the systems of control that had defined his life lost their central force, and the estate he had constructed as an extension of his identity was left without a voice capable of directing its meaning forward. Death stripped the illusion of permanence from an environment designed to resist change, revealing that preservation without succession is inherently unstable. The absence of a direct descendant transformed wealth from continuity into residue, something preserved in structure but emptied of purpose. What remained was a carefully ordered world, suddenly detached from intention, its silence no longer chosen, but imposed. Without an heir to reinterpret, defend, or adapt the vision, the estate entered a state of suspension, existing without agency, authority, or emotional ownership. Death converted control into inertia, perfection into stasis, and order into something vulnerable to reinterpretation by outsiders. The lack of succession revealed a deeper truth. That legacy requires transmission, not merely accumulation. Deering's wealth had been immense, his control precise, his environment refined, yet none of these qualities guaranteed continuation beyond his lifetime. Without an heir, the estate could not function as a living dynasty, only as a preserved artifact of a private philosophy. The transition from life to absence was marked not by chaos, but by uncertainty. as the question of purpose replaced the certainty of command. Death removed the singular perspective that had unified every detail, leaving behind a structure capable of endurance, but not direction. The absence of an heir transformed memory into negotiation, as institutions, caretakers, and observers became responsible for interpreting a vision they did not originate. What had once been personal became administrative, and what had once been intimate became historical. Without a living successor to anchor meaning, the estate drifted toward institutionalization, its future defined less by intention than by necessity. Death revealed that control, no matter how absolute in life, dissolves without continuity, leaving behind a vacuum where authority once resided. The lack of an heir intensified the sense of finality, as there was no familial narrative to soften the transition, no lineage to extend the story beyond the individual. The estate's survival depended not on bloodline, but on external preservation, transforming a private sanctuary into a public responsibility. This shift altered the nature of legacy itself, replacing personal inheritance with collective stewardship. Death without an heir forced the estate into a new identity, one shaped by preservation rather than purpose, by memory rather than agency. The silence that followed was not merely the absence of a person, but the disappearance of authorship, as no single voice remained to define what the space was meant to be. Without an heir to absorb and reinterpret the vision, the estate became fixed in time, resistant to evolution yet vulnerable to reinterpretation. Death exposed the limits of solitary legacy, demonstrating that wealth without succession cannot sustain narrative authority. The absence of a direct inheritor transformed the estate into a question rather than an answer, prompting reflection on what remains when intention ends. In this state, preservation replaced progression, and history replaced identity. Death severed the link between control and continuity, revealing that perfection achieved in isolation cannot guarantee relevance beyond its creator. The estate endured physically, but its meaning became fluid, subject to external interpretation rather than internal command. Without an heir, the legacy lost its future tense, existing only as a preserved past. Death marked the moment when wealth ceased to function as a living force and became instead a silent witness to a life concluded without succession. The absence of lineage underscored the ultimate limitation of control, that no environment, however refined, can inherit intention on its own. Death without an heir transformed the estate into a monument rather than a dynasty, ensuring its survival as a structure while confirming the end of its role as a living extension of personal will. What remained was not continuation, but endurance, not authority, but memory, leaving behind a legacy defined as much by absence as by achievement. Chapter 9. What happens to a palace? Without a dynasty, when a palace outlives the family that gave it purpose, it enters a different phase of existence, one defined not by continuity, but by negotiation, where meaning is no longer inherited, but reassigned. Without a dynasty to sustain authority, a palace becomes a structure in search of identity, preserved physically, yet detached from the living framework that once justified its scale, its expense, and its isolation. The absence of lineage transforms permanence into uncertainty, as the estate must now survive without the guiding logic that once unified every decision within its walls. What was once private intention becomes public interpretation, and the palace shifts from a living environment into a subject of debate, stewardship, and reinterpretation. Without heirs to defend exclusivity, the boundaries that once separated the palace from the surrounding world lose their legitimacy, inviting questions about access, ownership, and responsibility. The transition is rarely abrupt. Instead, it unfolds gradually, as maintenance replaces authorship, and preservation substitutes for vision. A palace without a dynasty does not collapse immediately, but it begins to drift, its future shaped less by design than by circumstance. The rituals that once sustained order dissolve, leaving behind routines focused on conservation rather than continuity. Rooms designed for presence become spaces of absence, their purpose defined by what they once held rather than what they now contain. The silence changes character, shifting from chosen restraint to institutional quiet, a calm maintained by regulation rather than will. Without a family narrative to anchor its meaning, the palace becomes vulnerable to external frameworks, historical interpretation, tourism, and cultural reassessment. What was once an extension of identity becomes an artifact subject to classification. This transformation alters the nature of power embedded within the structure, as authority moves away from the individual and toward institutions tasked with deciding how the palace should be remembered, displayed, or repurposed. The palace survives, but its survival depends on relevance rather than lineage. Without a dynasty, preservation becomes conditional, justified not by inheritance, but by cultural value, aesthetic significance, or public interest. This shift introduces a subtle instability, as the palace must continuously prove its worth to remain intact. The loss of familial continuity exposes the fragility of monumental wealth, revealing that scale alone cannot guarantee permanence without narrative succession. A palace without heirs becomes static, frozen at the moment of its creator's departure, unable to evolve organically because no internal authority remains to adapt it. Change, when it occurs, is imposed rather than chosen, shaped by committees, regulations, and external expectations. The estate transitions from private sanctuary to managed space, its intimacy replaced by accessibility and its exclusivity softened by obligation. This process redefines the palace's relationship with time, anchoring it permanently in the past, while requiring constant intervention to prevent physical decline. Without a dynasty to absorb the burden of upkeep, preservation becomes a collective responsibility, transforming personal wealth into public duty. The palace's meaning fractures into multiple interpretations, each reflecting the values of those who encounter it rather than the intentions of its creator. Without bloodline continuity, the estate cannot transmit tradition as lived experience, only as curated history. This separation between structure and lineage reveals a deeper truth about legacy, that architecture can endure, but authority does not. A palace without a dynasty becomes a mirror for societal values, reflecting how future generations choose to remember wealth, power, and isolation. Its survival no longer affirms dominance, but prompts inquiry, inviting scrutiny into the conditions that made its existence possible. Without heirs to shield it from reinterpretation, the palace becomes exposed to moral reassessment, its grandeur contextualized rather than celebrated uncritically. The transition strips away the illusion that permanence can exist independently of human continuity. What remains is a structure suspended between reverence and examination, admired for craftsmanship yet questioned for origin. The palace persists not as a living organism, but as a preserved state, maintained through effort rather than inheritance. Without a dynasty, time does not pass naturally within its walls. It accumulates as layers of interpretation. Each generation projects its own understanding onto the structure, reshaping its meaning without altering its form. This condition transforms the palace into a symbol rather than a residence, its identity defined by absence rather than presence. The loss of lineage ensures that no future will unfold organically from its past, only interpretations layered upon a fixed foundation. In this way, a palace without a dynasty becomes a cautionary emblem of wealth, concentrated without succession, demonstrating that endurance without continuity produces monuments, not living legacies. What once functioned as a private world becomes a public question, asking not who will inherit it, but why it should endure at all. The palace remains standing, but its authority dissolves, replaced by memory, maintenance, and meaning assigned from the outside. Without a dynasty, the palace survives as form rather than function, as evidence rather than influence, marking the point where wealth outlives intention and architecture remains after power has withdrawn. Chapter 10. The Weight of What Remains. What remains after wealth has spoken its final word is not silence, but weight, a lingering pressure embedded in walls, spaces, and memory, carrying forward the consequences of ambition long after intention has vanished. When a palace endures beyond its creator and outlives the dynasty that never came to be, it becomes more than an artifact of privilege. It becomes a burden of meaning imposed on every generation that inherits it indirectly. The weight of what remains is not measured in stone or scale, but in the unresolved tension between admiration and discomfort, between preservation and reckoning. Structures built to transcend time often succeed physically while failing philosophically, leaving behind environments that demand interpretation without offering resolution. What once symbolized control, refinement, and escape transforms into a question posed to history: what was gained, what was sacrificed, and who was excluded in the process. The absence of a living voice to defend or explain the original vision intensifies this weight, as memory must now operate without guidance, shaped by external values rather than internal authority. Preservation ensures survival, but survival alone does not confer innocence. The estate stands intact, yet stripped of narrative ownership, its grandeur inseparable from the context that produced it. Time does not absolve architecture, it reframes it, forcing each generation to confront the uncomfortable reality that beauty can coexist with inequality, and refinement can emerge from imbalance. The weight of what remains presses not only on the structure, but on those who choose to maintain it, compelling society to decide whether remembrance is an act of reverence or responsibility. Without a dynasty to absorb accountability, the palace becomes a shared inheritance, distributing moral obligation across institutions, visitors, and historians alike. This diffusion of responsibility does not lighten the burden, it amplifies it, as no single entity can claim authorship or closure. The estate persists as a physical constant while its meaning evolves, accumulating layers of interpretation that reflect shifting cultural priorities rather than original intent. What was designed as permanence becomes a test of endurance, challenging modern observers to reconcile admiration for craftsmanship with awareness of the systems that enabled its creation. The weight intensifies precisely because the structure survives. Absence of decay denies the comfort of finality. Ruins invite nostalgia, but preservation demands confrontation. Each restored surface reinforces the reality that wealth once concentrated enough power to impose a private vision onto public memory. The estate's continued presence insists that history be acknowledged rather than erased, resisting the temptation to reduce the past to abstraction. The weight of what remains lies in this refusal to disappear, in the demand that legacy be examined rather than celebrated uncritically. Without heirs to humanize the narrative, the structure stands as an impersonal testament to ambition unchecked by continuity. It becomes a mirror, reflecting societal values back upon itself, revealing how admiration for elegance often coexists with selective amnesia. The burden is not the building itself, but the questions it refuses to answer. Who benefits from preservation? Who bears its cost? And whose stories remain unheard within its walls? The estate's survival converts private excess into public discourse, transforming luxury into evidence rather than aspiration. Over time, the structure acquires authority not through lineage, but through endurance, shaping collective memory simply by remaining visible. This endurance forces acknowledgement that wealth can outlast intention, and power can persist beyond accountability. The weight grows heavier as distance from origin increases, because detachment invites reinterpretation without resolution. The palace no longer belongs to its creator, nor to a family, but to history, and history is indifferent to comfort. It records without forgiveness and preserves without empathy. The structure's continued existence challenges the notion that legacy is inherently virtuous, revealing instead that legacy is neutral, capable of honoring achievement while exposing imbalance. The weight of what remains is the realization that permanence does not imply justification, and survival does not equal moral clarity. In standing intact, the estate denies the luxury of forgetting, compelling each observer to engage with the contradictions embedded in its foundation. It exists as proof that wealth can shape reality long after the individual disappears, and that architecture can enforce memory without offering meaning. Ultimately, the weight is not carried by the past, but by the present, by those who must decide how to interpret, preserve, and contextualize what endures. The palace remains, but it no longer speaks for itself. It waits, imposing its presence, demanding reflection, and reminding us that what survives history is not always what history chooses to forgive.